All right, here we go. People are coming in. Thank you so much for joining us. Nicolai will talk for a few minutes as we let everybody come in here. Nicolai, good to see you.
And you?
This is an exciting topic. We had a lot of people, a lot of interest in today's webinar. Just as a reminder for everybody, as you're watching either the video or you're here live, this is a weekly webinar series that we're doing here at T360. It changes the topics. One good thing, and Chris Riley in our marketing department is going to plug in the YouTube channel. You have the ability to go and see all the ones and all the topics and talks that we've been doing on a weekly basis. So it's a wealth of information and knowledge and that's been shared on these webinars. So with that, Nicolai, good to see you, man. We're excited about introducing you to the, not introducing you to the group. A lot of people know you, but really as toward with T360 and our partnership and working in the valuation and the merger and acquisition space. Let me first start off and say welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Excited to join. Great topic.
Yeah. And this is something too, for those of you on the call, Nicolai and I have a history together. We actually worked together at Anywhere, which was Realogy at the time. And Nicolai, I'll ask him to please just do a synopsis of his career. It's incredible, but I'll give some highlights on that. And that's running the merger and acquisition division at Realogy. I keep on wanting to say Realogy, Anywhere, for 15 years, and also having some relationship with and a partnership with Steve Murray at Real Trends. And so being in the M&A space, the valuation space, it's not something that you're just dipping your toe in, right, Nicolai? You've been doing this for a little while, haven't you?
Yeah, I kind of grew up, if you will, in the M&A space. So I might date myself a little bit here, but I joined what was then Realogy, actually, believe it or not. It was Sendent when I first began in 1998. So, I started as a young kid in the back room, crunching numbers and doing the M&A work, and quickly grew up to where I took over that group. So, like you said, it was a little over 15 years in total that I was with Realogy. It was actually over two stints. So 11 years one time and 6 years afterwards, five. Heading up M&A, did that for a decade. And I was also COO of Better Homes and Gardens when we first launched that. And I ran their business intel, competitive intel groups. So, in the acquisition space, looked at over 1,000 companies I've done valuations and analyses on, and over 300 acquisitions. I was Steve Murray's partner for 3 years over at Real Trends, sort of between as well, and even had 3 years with a private equity firm. So a few different experiences along the way.
I'm glad you brought up the COO, the Chief Operating Officer at BH&G, Better Homes and Garden, because that also allows those that are watching this, Nicolai, not only has he been crunching numbers and doing valuations and putting deals together with merger and acquisitions, and also one thing we want to make sure we highlight as well that you've done, I know this is about merger and acquisitions, but you do a good bit on commission analysis, commission plan analysis as well. So that's another piece of this equation. But with that, the operations piece really goes to everybody who's watching this, who's an entrepreneur, who's running an organization. And as you and I talk about, it's an asset. That asset is worth something, right? And so the idea is let's look at it as an asset, and then how can you increase that value? And we'll get into that. And we'll talk about that as we go through this. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in, Nicolai, because I know we've got a lot to share. Everybody that's on the call, the question and Q&A is on there. Just go ahead and throw out a question if you have it as we go through it. And then we're going to make sure we leave time at the end to dive into the questions and answers.
Great. So I'm going to share screen now, and you let me know, Dean, when this looks good on your end.
Okay, we got it. Go ahead.
See everything there? Okay. So thanks first off, and appreciate everybody joining us. And I know this is an exciting topic. And as Dean said, M&A is one lever that you can pull to look to grow your company. And I'd even say, even for those who might be thinking about one day selling their company, I think there are a lot of great lessons that can be learned from this. And one thing I always say to people too is just knowing the things that somebody like me looks at in terms of what makes one company more valuable than another is really important in terms of just managing your business. I mean, everybody should have an exit strategy, even if that exit strategy is 20 years out, and just having that knowledge helps you to sort of manage your business better. So I hope at the very least, everybody gets a little something out of this. So I'm actually going to, Dean, hand it back to you just so you can do a brief intro on T360 before I kick in.
Yeah, this is sort of something we wanted to put in a little bit for those that are watching and aren't familiar with our organization or have not a complete sense of the areas that we operate in. One of the lines I always say to kind of give it perspective is if you think of some of the large consulting organizations in the world, like McKinsey or Boston or something along those lines, we're the largest consulting organization within the white picket fence of residential real estate. That's who T360 is. And here's outlined these bullets, the services. So brokerage and team consulting, that's what I oversee and work with Lisa Picardo on my team and others, and Nicolai and others in our space to help support brokerages and teams. We do a financial benchmarking as well. Organized real estate, we actually have our division that supports MLSs and associations and technology consulting. We have quite a few really savvy technology focused people that run our technology consulting business division. And in that space, they support technology providers, but they also work with real estate companies and brokerages and large teams to help making sure and looking at their tech stack and seeing are they in the best place for where they want to go and as if they want to scale their business, are they using the right technologies? Talent and hiring, we place about 70 management to C-level executives in our space each year in our talent and hiring division, our T3 talent division. Event planning and execution, we actually run some of the largest events in the space. So 10, 14,000 agent organizations that come together once a year for a conference. We run those along with much smaller events, of course, as well. So we handle everything from the event planning, the location finding, managed staffing, all those things we can handle. Marketing consulting, we dive in, we do the brand work. We dive in whether you want to rebrand or whether you're getting started, want a brand, or want to also dive in and see your value proposition and hone in that value proposition. We do a great bit in the marketing consulting space. Valuations, merger and acquisitions, and the commission plan analysis that I mentioned just a minute ago is where we're here to discuss that today. And then we have industry research and reports. And as Nicolai, you take me to the next slide, that's going to be that's why we were founded. We were actually founded through this with our trends report. That's our 20th year of writing the biggest trends that we feel are going to be impacting our business. And we write about it. We spend about 1,000 hours doing a deep dive and then write about that. So T3trends.com gives you a lot of insight in that. I encourage you to go ahead and subscribe and just get on a yearly basis. One thing our clients do, and I encourage you to do the same, is really take one chapter at a time, work with your leadership team, or if your leadership team is just you now, just read that one chapter and then dissect it and see how you can impact or what things you can do to change and grow your business. And then we have the Real Estate Almanac. The Almanac is where we do a combination of a bunch of things, two of which I'll highlight. One is the SP 200, the ranking of the 200 most powerful people in our space, in the real estate space. And then also we do the Mega 1000. We rank the top 1,000 brokerages across the US, and that is in sales volume and in units. And the one thing about our Mega 1000, which is different than other rankings, there are quite a few organizations that don't give over their numbers. And so we actually go out and we dive in and we find out and we research and then we publish those numbers that we come up with of what we're able to find. And so we do include everybody in our Mega 1000. We don't exclude anybody because they're not giving us their numbers. So just some insight into T360.
Appreciate that, Dean. So everybody buckle up now. What we're going to try to do here is as best we can over this, kind of half hour that we have. And I'm happy to go over if we need to for Q&A that lasts longer. But I do want to respect your time. So this is going to be a little bit of a crash course, sort of A to Z, and some of the processes we go through in M&A. And I think what you'll see here is that there are certain areas that you're going to feel very comfortable saying, I can do that. There are certain areas that you may say, gee, I might need somebody else's help. I personally and we collectively sort of become involved in all aspects of this, depending on, where a person needs and wants help. So there's sort of three main areas, and I'm going to dive into each of them. And the first is simply identifying prospects, looking at which companies in your marketplace and different strategies that you can use, to help just identify who might be somebody good to have a conversation with. And then a little bit, obviously, in the time we have here, some of the basics on the analysis of the opportunity. What are some of the ratios we look at? And then that, of course, leads into, what is it like to put together a deal? What are the multiples right now? How are the different valuation methods? and what's that due diligence process look like. So along the way, I'll try to give some pointers here, try to make this relevant both for real estate brokerages and teams. I think a lot of the process is the same. So those of you who are managing teams, there are some slight differences, but this is meant to be relevant to everybody. So let's start with sort of the prospecting, the initial going out there and looking at, who is out there, what are the right matches. And the good news is, unless you're in some market like, say, Manhattan, most of you have good information that you can get simply from the MLS. Most of you probably have a good idea of who the companies are that you might want to talk to. But even if you know who they are, some of the info that you can and I believe should be getting from the MLS should get you to, like, how similar or dissimilar is this company to mine? Because I might use the MLS just to narrow down, is there a certain size that I'm looking at? Is there a certain geography that I'm looking at? A certain price point that I want? All these things, you can call this information very, very easily. But I like to take it a step farther and look at things like, how many transactions per person is a potential company doing versus mine? Relative to that, though, if I can get information on individual agents, which typically you can within the MLS, why is their transactions per person, as one example, different than mine? Is it because you have a lot of part-timers, or is it because you may have a few agents who are really generating a huge amount of production, as opposed to, everybody being kind of equal? And what I usually tell people is, at this point, you're not necessarily getting any great truths from the data. It's not kind of a binary, yes, no, I'm going to do it based on this data. Some things may point out, you may say, listen, I'm at 1.2 million average sales price. Maybe looking at a company that's doing $200,000 in average sales price, those are some pretty big cultural differences and big client differences. But maybe you want to move into different markets. But most of the time, this just highlights some things that are good to bring up, good questions that you can start digging into. And even if you know another company well, doing a little bit of this research kind of puts you at the table and gives you a sense that I know a little bit more about this company. I can talk a little bit about this company. And that often helps move the conversation along. If you can just sort of drop in, hey, yeah, I happen to notice this. Now, the other thing is, what I like to say is sometimes you may find out that a given company is really made up of just a couple high producers. And I'd much rather come to that realization before I've signed an NDA or reached out to them. Because if you conclude that you're better off just recruiting a couple people, you don't want to be at that point after you've signed an NDA, after you've collected financials, and then try to recruit those people. Even if you don't have an explicit no recruit clause in your NDA, you can get yourself in a sticky spot. And even if you sort of survive the legal aspect of it, bluntly, just from a reputation standpoint, it's not a great place to be where you're collecting financials and then recruiting people. So I'd rather find that out beforehand than afterwards. So as I kind of move, let's say I've now narrowed down who I want to talk to. Here's the reach out point. Now, in a lot of cases, you, the broker owner, may be the best one to make that reach out. There are cases where I get brought in, even at this point, where somebody says, I'm just not comfortable making that initial approach, or I just know they won't pick up the phone because they just aren't comfortable talking to somebody who's a tight competitor of theirs. But what you're really trying to do, in addition to establishing rapport, you're trying to dig in just a little bit. And ultimately, sort of that middle question, what are the pain points? What is it that keeps them up at night? And how can you be a solution to that? Um, Understanding a little bit about what they want, what they need, are they realistic? You're trying to just piece together a story right here. But come into this recognizing that you may have to talk to many, many companies, or any one company. This process can take weeks, months, and even years to get through, where somebody's finally comfortable actually handing you financials and doing an analysis. And some people may never get there. So be prepared to talk to a lot of companies. Now, we've gotten past that point, let's say, and you have a company that is ready to actually share financial information. This is probably the most common area where somebody like me gets involved, because more often than not, that local company, although they may be comfortable with that step, they may not be comfortable actually handing that right over to you. Hopefully you've established rapport and they are able to do that. And so what I want to do is give you a little sense of what that analytic period looks like and some of the things we look at. Obviously, this isn't all inclusive, but this should give you a little bit of an idea, and you can sort of assess whether this is something that you feel comfortable running yourself. Obviously, you want to sign a non-disclosure agreement, a confidentiality agreement. That's to protect both of you at this point. And then, that even that piece of paper can get everybody a little bit more comfortable over what's going on. And ultimately, what you would look to do is get several years. I like at least 3 years of financials, especially everything that we've gone through with COVID, sort of post COVID and the immediate aftermath and the kind of artificial bumps that were going on. I like to sort of look at, in an ideal state, even pre COVID, if I could, just to get a sense of some of the trends. But at least 3 years of financials is what I suggest. And what you're really driving at here is you're trying to normalize the income, or somebody like me is trying to normalize the income. Most privately held businesses, you're going to have some expenses in there that wouldn't be in there if it was total third party. Maybe it's as small as auto insurance and auto payments, but I've seen kids' college tuition thrown in there. I've seen everything at some point. Now, a savvy seller is often going to be really aggressive about, hey, here's my add backs, add this back to the bottom line. But if you're a careful buyer, you also want to look for what are the expenses that should be in that P&L that aren't. Maybe they own the building and they're not charging themselves fair market value rent. Maybe they're a big producer themselves and they're not applying a split. They're probably not going to join you and be on a 0% split. So you need to impute what that proper split would be. Maybe they don't pay themselves a salary. There's all kinds of things that can also bring that EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, that EBITDA number down. We sort of joke that EBITDA, the other acronym for that is earnings before I trick the damn accountant. Because a lot of people are like, oh, here are the different things I need to do to go in there and sort of trick you. So have a careful eye out and listen to the things they say, but you need to be very objective in this process. So you're trying to get to that EBITDA number. Now, if you can, these other points that I put in there, at the very least, try to understand them. You can wait to get the documents until due diligence, but like, who are the owners? Are there phantom owners out there? Is there somebody who thinks they have ownership? Are there key people, whether it's agents or employees? Do they have a mortgage relationship? Do they have any other kinds of other businesses? And probably most importantly, are they part of a franchise system right now? You can have a conversation with somebody who's under a franchise agreement. Don't be afraid to have that conversation, that initial one. But starting to get deep into analysis, if there are years to go in a franchise relationship and you can't be in a position where you're trying to advise them how to break that, that's something they need to do. There is something called tortious interference. We can get into sort of the legal aspect of that in another discussion, but be mindful of that. And obviously, if they have a ways to go on a franchise agreement and they don't have any clear out, and most don't, many think they do, most don't, you probably need to pause that conversation. So once I've gotten that information, there's all kinds of different analyses that I like to run through. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to assess risk. Is one deal riskier than another deal? And even the same company may have a different risk analysis to different potential buyers. So your analysis here is going to be very unique to you and the company you're looking at. There's all kinds of terms you might hear. Breakage, I think, is something that people hear about often, and that simply is agents who may not join you afterwards. Here's the cold hard reality of what we're doing here with a residential real estate brokerage acquisition. There are not a lot of assets that we're acquiring. The assets are the people, and these people have feet and they can and do walk if they're not happy. They're 1099s. They are not owners in most cases, so you can't tie them with a non-compete agreement. So you have to make sure that they are happy. Otherwise, your production quite literally walks out the door. But the second one that people don't often think about, but often can be an even bigger issue, is what we call slippage. So slippage is a case where I've kept the people, but in order to keep them, I've had to increase their commission splits. Or maybe your splits are higher than theirs or vice versa. And agents are going to end up talking to each other, and suddenly somebody who is on a 70% split is on an 85% split. That's slippage. And that can be a real big issue on the bottom line. And we'll get into this later on in terms of deal structure, how to try to protect yourself for this. So there could be things like, we call synergies, sort of cost savings. Maybe you planned on merging the offices together right away, but you find out as you get along, or even on announcement day, boy, people are really resistant to that, and you worry about breakage or slippage, so you delay the synergies. So ultimately, with all these things, I'm trying to analyze and say, what's kind of the worst case scenario in any one of these what ifs? And what does that look like? And you can sort of analyze yourself to where you're scared to do anything. You want to be realistic of it. What's a worst case? What's a best case? What's a middle or likely case? And at least analyze and say, now, can I structure a deal that both gives the potential in a best case scenario where we both win, but protects me in the worst case scenario? And that's sort of the key. So talking about structure. Let me pause just for a second. Dean, anything, any questions coming up or comments you have
No,
as I go along?
I'm just kind of, for time purposes, I want to just, there's
Yeah.
so much to get into here. I'm going to ask a question here, but I love the one point you're going to get into it in this slide here and the next one, where you talk about that checklist, because a lot of people, I'm sure, are thinking, fearfully, like, boy, there's so many moving pieces and parts to this. And the idea is there there's a path, there's a checklist, there's things that could help minimize those things that Nicolai just shared with you, the breakage, the slippage, things along those lines. There's some things you can do preemptively to make sure you're ahead of that curve and you keep that minimized as much as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And we'll definitely get on that as I start to move a little bit, the next couple slides kind of into beyond structure and diligence. But, there's a lot of moving pieces here, and having somebody kind of think about all those different points. I mean, that checklist you referred to, I literally have a 200-point checklist on all the things you need to think about beyond just collecting financials to put two companies together, right down to like, planning an announcement day and the dinners and press releases and sort of the ultimate sort of checklist that somebody can go through. So valuations right now, this is the question people always have. Now multiples, so there's generally two different ways most residential brokerages will get valued. Method number one, we talked about that sort of normalized EBITDA. You get to that point and you apply a multiple on that. And multiples right now can be as low as 2.5 times that in some cases, but generally right now are kind of in the, call it 2.5 to 4 time range for most brokerages. Some go a little bit beyond. And to the extent that you've got different earning streams, whether that's title, mortgage, property management, I do that kind of work as well. Those multiples may be different. And for a business that just has a few transactions in some of the other areas, it all gets blended. But for those that have, true other businesses and business lines, you'll have various multiples that will get blended together. The second way is to actually look at the company dollar, the gross profit. So everything that's kept by the house after the agent gets his or her split, and you take a percentage of that. And that too can have a wide range. It could be as little as 25% of a 1 year company dollar, and as high right now, probably as 75% or so. And most are kind of falling somewhere in the middle there. Now, I talked about this before. One of the things I do is I try to give an arm's length valuation. So there will be a single number when I generate that. Yet to two different buyers, you could have two very different views of what the potential value of the business is. So keep all this in mind that, what I'm trying to give you here is guidance and what the market bears, but you need to be creative, and what's right for you is right for you. So these aren't hard set rules that you have to follow. These are guideposts. So typically an acquisition right now is going to have some component of cash guaranteed versus a component that's earnout. Now the average buyer, of course, is going to want to lay out as little cash as possible and have as much in the earnout and have that earnout stretched out as long as possible. The typical seller wants it all cash, all guaranteed. Somewhere between is where we fall in. Now, most transactions right now, the cash part is maybe 50%. I've seen some higher. I've seen a lot lower right now. There's, as in a given market, more or fewer buyers are out there. This is one of the things that changes. If there's not a lot of competition, well, then the sole buyers that are out there can go pretty low on the cash. Earnouts are generally a year or two. More often than not, I'm seeing them 2 years now. And earnouts are usually based on company dollar. Sometimes GCI, I don't recommend it because again, if the splits change,
Mhm.
you're still paying on that top line. You'd love to have it as a buyer on EBITDA on the bottom line earnings, but it's hard. It's hard to kind of manage that, and so GCI or company dollar, sorry, company dollar or closed gross profit is generally what it's based off of. And then there's the whole, is it an asset buy? Is it a stock buy? We can definitely get deeper into this on any other call, but in short, almost all acquisitions right now are purchase of the assets rather than a buy of the stock of the company. But you want to think about things like, are there leaders within the business? Is the former owner wanting a position? Do you want them to have a position? So that kind of moves us a little bit into, I talked before about how there are relatively few tangibles in a business. Generally speaking, you're not buying the desks or the tables or the computers. You're buying the hope of future production. Um, but that is sort of an intangible, but there's lots of other intangibles. And so often I see this is where deals can get tripped up because people don't talk and think about these things until either the very end or realize them afterwards. To some degree, the numbers part of putting together a company can be the easy part. This is where things really need to be thought through. So, I've listed just some of them here, but the uniqueness one, think about that as just sort of a general term for culture. I mean, everybody's got some culture. You've got it, they've got it. Even a company that doesn't have culture, well, that's kind of a culture in and of itself. Like, get to know that. What makes a company different? And most people, of course, believe very deeply that they are different than everybody else. And appreciating that and understanding that is going to be very important. And so, this comment I have on the bottom is one that you may want to think about throughout the process. If you kind of come right in and say, I'm buying you, I'm taking you over, it sort of feels like one side wins and one side loses. And even if it is an acquisition, sometimes just talking about things as a coming together or a merger helps culturally kind of put two companies together. So these are just some of the issues that you want to think about along the way, but they become really important. Oops. So,
One quick note on this before you,
yeah,
Nicolai, to everyone's, that's so important of a topic because so many owners, and this is something to think about. You might have smaller, mid-sized, but smaller companies out there that you'd love to roll in. And sometimes, frankly, just taking over their debt obligations could help make that happen. But that's where they actually want to say, I was acquired. They're going to think like, so that sometimes you have to play in the ego is huge, as in my experience, and I'm sure in yours, when you have these two leaders or leadership teams, you have to make sure you stroke the egos and understand the ego piece, because that's even outside of money is the ego and how people are going to be portrayed after this is all done.
100%. And you kind of even hint at something else there that's really important. Just because a company might have negative earnings doesn't mean there's no value to it. So think about that in the sense of, you may have a business that's losing money year after year, and the person might be thinking, I have to shut the doors. But you might be able to merge two offices together, and really it's just a roll in of that company dollar into yours, and you can pay an override into that. So that's a case of a business now actually seeing value for something that somebody else may say there's no value in it. And that's a great way for somebody to sort of save face, to your point there, Dean, where they can say this was an acquisition. There's a lot of tough conversations that go on with businesses that might have once had a huge valuation, but just given the times, it gets a little tougher. So as we get down to it, ultimately there's sort of three tracks to closing right here. And in an ideal world, and I strongly recommend this, you nominate somebody to own each track. And my very strong belief is you, as the broker owner, should be owning that third track. You need to be thinking about every day the integration. This is that sort of 200-point checklist. If you can have somebody right there to help you manage that. But everything, put yourself on the stage the day of the announcement, or even if it's just in front of the other agents. What are the questions they're going to ask you? What are the questions consumers are going to ask you? Why did you do this? What's going to happen to my commissions afterwards? I have a closing happening today. What do I do? Think about those sorts of things, because that's where the rubber hits the road, if you will. And for some, there could be a fourth track if you're actually financing an acquisition. But really, you want somebody owning each of these tracks and managing that. Very often I come in and I sort of help own and manage that first track. You hire an outside attorney to draft and review contracts, but you need to focus on that third track. So we told you that this was going to be sort of a crash course in it. But any one of these topics, happy to really dive deep into. And I think this is where Dean asked, use the chat here or contact us afterwards if there's certain topics that you really want to dive in. And we're happy to go into much more detail. You can't learn the A to Z of M&A in under half an hour, but hopefully you feel like you really learned a good bit here. So again, take us through the 3 stages. Think about what you can do just in the identification stage with MLS info. And even making that decision, do I buy or do I recruit? That's the best time to do it. So when you're analyzing companies, think about kind of how theirs compares to yours. Think about how certain ratios might have changed over time, productivity per person, even things like, dollars per transaction. Has that changed over time? Is it better or worse than the market? That's kind of what you're getting at there. And it just helps you ask questions. And then think creatively when you're putting together a deal. I've talked a lot about sort of, the different multiples and ratios and things like that. Those are good guidelines and they're very real. But ultimately, a creative mindset is the best asset you can have to putting 2 things together. But ultimately, it comes down to planning. The farther along you get in that process, you start to pull other people along and you really need to plan that out. But, I hope you feel a little bit more empowered now to be able to start this out.
And that brings up a question for everybody that's watching this here live. In the Q&A, if you could just put in there, Nicolai and I talked about going deeper in each one of these, as we've made this comment now twice on this call. So if it's identify, like what are the things, steps that are best to help you identify those potential targets? What would that be something you'd like us? Because each one of these could be an easy 20-minute webinar. Analyzing the analyzing stages. What are the steps? And then we can get deeper in each one of these. Make the deal. What are the deal structures, creative approaches, things like that. And then what's the plan? And those key areas, those tracks, those railroad tracks that Nicolai had up there. Is that something that you'd really like to hear more about? So just utilize the Q&A. Just throw it in and say, I'd love it. Just type in one word, analyze, identify, make the deal, plan, or go into more detail if you like. And again, if you have a question, let us know. Because from your feedback and your input that you provide to us on this call, that'll be what we'll talk about the next time when we have our next webinar on this topic. So great job, Nicolai.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and put up our contact information in case anybody wants to reach out directly to Nicolai. There's his contact information. You see the email right there, Nicolai@t360.com. Make sure you write down the spelling correctly because Nicolai's got a great spelling of his name. And you got my information there, Dean@t360.com, and you've got our numbers as well. Very easy to reach out to us and connect with us. And I guess the one thing I'll also leave with is when we talk about, and just as a recap, guys, for everyone on this call and everyone who's watching the video, we do the valuations. Nicolai comes in, we'll do a valuation to help support you in your growth. We also do in the M&A space. We have some organizations who approach us, say, you know what, I'm interested in expanding into a marketplace that we're not in. So that's outreach. That's doing actually cold calling. It's doing a scrubbing as to the first step that Nicolai said is kind of like deciding what brokerages, what entities in the market you'd like to talk to that kind of that are in alignment with your model. For example, like you don't want to go from a traditional commission schedule and then look at a flat fee company and try to bring those together. That could be disastrous. So you want to make sure you have your hit list. What would be that? What's that look like? So that outreach is a piece that we also support organizations with in the M&A space. And there are also organizations that you've had these calls. Nicolai mentioned this. You might have you've talked to people, you have a connection with somebody in your market that you get along with to some level, some degree. You are competitors. And so if you don't feel comfortable doing that outreach, or if you've had some conversations, but you can't get it over the finish line, I always said, it's like sitting at the kitchen table between a buyer and seller and try to come to terms on the buying and the selling of that home. It becomes difficult, as we all know. And it's the same thing with real estate companies. So having that trusted third party to come in and facilitate some level of communication, moving it to an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, and then moving into terms is something that Nicolai, and that's something we do as well, and we support that activity. So if that's an interest. And the last thing is the commission plan analysis. We have quite a few organizations who approach us and say, you know what, things have changed. We've had this commission schedule in place. We've kind of tweaked it. We've got about 60% of our agents on exceptions now. Things along nice. So it's not bad to take a look at a deep dive, analyze what would be the impact if we tweak this or change this, or maybe I've got some competitors who've come into my market and I'm really trying to offset some of that. I'm trying to create something that's a little more sticky in my commission schedule. So that's something also that we'll dive into on the commission schedule. So I want to make sure I put all that out to everybody. Nicolai, any final thoughts before we end the call?
No, I mean, I think you covered everything there. Listen, this is, we sort of are at the tip of the iceberg right here. I've literally taken almost what I've done here and broken all those up into what's ended up being an entire day session for certain companies in the past. So any one of these, there's clearly a lot to get into, and as you mentioned, I mean, areas outside of the M&A. So I mean, I love helping companies come together in any way I can help. The financials and the valuation is one part, but ultimately, it's so much like your analogy, sitting at a kitchen table, the way you all have throughout your careers, trying to get two people to sort of see eye to eye. And I love thinking through the different challenges and what it takes to actually make a merger work. It's incredibly satisfying. Love the work.
So with that, guys, there's our contact. Please reach out. From looking at the Q&A, the most feedback came on analyze, Nicolai, on analyzing those deals in the market. So that'll be our next topic. Thank you so much for your feedback. We did have somebody also said, what about moving into a market that you're not in? I think I just addressed that in my comments about the outreach and going out and figuring out. There's a process we go through. Just to go a little more into that. We spent about 4 months in a 4-month agreement with an organization. The first month, we actually do a deep dive to analyze the market, the players, and then work through that hit list. What is that list? Who are we going to be outreaching to? Make sure that we're in alignment, and then we do the outreach and connection and then setting up of appointments and then work through a process. So if you have any interest in any of that or want to discuss further, just let us know. Nicolai, great job. Really appreciate you and grateful to be working with you again, like we did in the past, and excited to see the road that we're going down. Want to thank Chris Riley for all his help in the chat and the Q&A. Appreciate that. Thank you all very much. You all take care. This is going to be a great 2024. So time to soar in 2024.